those of you who weren't here when we started, and for your benefit, Ross, what we're going to do is we're going to go through all three speakers. We're going to let the introductions be in the book there. I think page 21 and 23 of your guide will have their bios, so we can have more time for their presentations. We're now hearing from Ross McKitrick and then David, and then I'll conduct the joint Q&A. Ross?
Well, I'm getting my talk ready. Just let me apologize for running in late, but if there was any doubt in the matter, I can assure you that they are checking name tags in the hallway, and you'll have to run back up to your room if you didn't bring it with you. Now, I think I can go slideshow. Marlo, help me out here. From current slide? Great, okay. So the points that I want to cover here, I want to introduce the idea of something called a truth-based carbon cap and trade. And essentially what I'm going to try to do is convince the audience at this meeting of all places that there is a form of cap and trade that we might actually all support. And for reasons that will become clear, why, if it's done in the right way, both skeptics and alarmists should all love the idea, but of course there will be a constituency out there that hates it. This is a subset of work that I'm doing at an academic level on what we would call an economic state contingent pricing in policy formation, but the underlying idea is very intuitive and straightforward and in a way humorous at the same time. So the political problem, and Marlo's touched on some of the horrendous extensions of the political problem, is that even if global warming is refuted as the basis for a cap and trade system, once it's in place it will be impossible to remove. And the reason, especially with cap and trade, is that it creates a large set of cartel profits. And the recipients of those profits, whether it's laundered through the government itself or whether it's handed directly out to certain recipients in the form of quota allocations, they will form the lobby that opposes any removal of the system, no matter how much damage it subsequently does. In Canada, I can explain this very easily by just pointing out that cap and trade is basically a milk marketing board for carbon. We have marketing boards in Canada that create cartels for farmers, and they're extremely profitable, and no matter how much damage they do to the food industry, they're not going to be removed because the lobby is too strong for them now. In June 2008, I testified before the Environment and Air Quality hearings, that should be EAQ, and as part of that and some follow-up material, my proposal to then Chairman Dingell was that any policy that's introduced should have an explicit mechanism to tie the stringency of the policy to the severity of the problem. That would be a natural principle that you apply in any other policy domain that's strangely absent in climate policy. And in particular, why not tie actual reductions in the cap to changes in the mean temperature of the tropical troposphere? Now, why the tropical troposphere? Here I'm going to briefly digress into material that will probably be presented better in other sessions. But if you look at the colorful panel over there, there are two dimensions in it. On the horizontal axis is latitude, and on the vertical axis is altitude. So along the horizontal axis, right in the middle, is the surface at the equator. And then as you move to the left, you're moving towards the North Pole. As you move to the right, you're moving to the South Pole. And as you move up, you're going into the troposphere and then the stratosphere above it. This is a picture that the parallel climate model used, one of the IPCC models, generated when it was fed the observed changes in all the major climate forcings over the 20th century. And this is the colors represent the expected temperature changes that would have resulted. Now, the model was run a bunch of times, each time changing one thing at a time. And you can see that the second panel on the left side there, greenhouse gases, is the dominant story here. In terms of the model, there's no real data in here. These aren't observations. These are model-generated data. The important thing here is that if you were going to look for a region of the atmosphere that's especially sensitive to greenhouse gases, this model, at any rate, would say it's that big red dot in the middle, which is the troposphere over the tropics. It's especially sensitive to the effect of observable changes in greenhouse gases, and it's large enough to dominate the total, which accumulated over the 20th century. Now, the U.S. Climate Change Science Program report did a similar kind of experiment, similar kinds of results. The troposphere over the tropics would be a good spot to use as an indicator of the progress of greenhouse gas-induced global warming. And then if we look at the future projections in the IPCC report, it's the same story. As you go forward, all the models have the same pattern, that the earliest effects are in the troposphere of the tropics. And I'm only mentioning this not to digress into why it's the case. I couldn't explain it, but I'm just noting that this is what all the models say. If you're going to measure the dimensions of the greenhouse gas problem, the place to measure is tropical troposphere. If there's a better place to measure, it's not obvious to me from the graphs, but open to suggestions. And then in the text of the report, I won't read this, but they just reiterate, this is where the maximum warming takes place. It emerges early, as an early response, a rapid adjustment of the atmosphere to the forcing, simulated with good consistency among the models. Okay. So now the problem of, at this point, and an active area of discussion, is that if you look at the typical projections of the warming rate, you have the Climate Change Science Program report implying a warming in that region of about 0.25 C per decade. The IPCC, the A1B scenario, we should currently be observing something like 0.5 C per decade in that region of the atmosphere. This is the remote sensing systems reading for the mid-troposphere, and we're not quite at the low end of the warming rate yet. But what that means is that we have a policy risk. A policy risk that will be obvious to people in this room, but not so obvious elsewhere, which is, what if we did all these things that Marla was talking about? What if we commit to an extremely expensive regulatory regime, and it turns out that it wasn't necessary? It will have been a complete waste, but we won't be able to get out of it. It would be entirely naive to think that the US legislative system could unravel a system that turned out to be completely unnecessary. So what do we do? Well, one alternative is just to try to blockade any and every suggestion that comes forward. Be a happy outcome if it turns out to work. But then people on the other side are going to say, yeah, but what if, okay, this is the situation now, but any day now, or any year now, or any decade now, we're going to start observing rapid warming, and at that point we'll need the legislation. So they're concerned about the risk on the other side. What if we do nothing and it turns out to be a big problem? Okay, at this point we have a whole bunch of alternative scenarios on the table, and each one implies a different kind of wish list about how the cap should evolve over time. Let's say the mid-range IPCC warming scenario turns out to be true. For those who endorse that scheme, they would probably think, well, we should have the cap drift down by about a third by 2030. Then you've got folks like Nicholas Stern who fear a worst-case scenario and would like the cap to go down by 95% by 2030. Or alternatively, what happens if there is no trend now and forever in the tropical troposphere? Then eventually people would have to concede, okay, greenhouse gases really don't have the effect we thought they did, in which case the entire premise for the legislation is gone. So that means we should revert to the business as usual case, which is that the US cap anyway would grow by about 1.3% per year, because that's your sort of background rate of growth of greenhouse gas emissions. And if the tropical troposphere were to start cooling, and we're really worried about global cooling and decide that greenhouse gas is the only way to prevent it, maybe you want to start subsidizing greenhouse gas emissions, but we can leave that one aside for now. So what I'm going to show you is there is a very simple rule that, if it's implemented today, would guarantee you wouldn't have to pick one of these. You'd get all of them. Okay, so the rule looks like this in algebraic terms. We adjust the cap. Next period's cap equals this period's plus 0.013. This is a 1.3% increase, minus a little factor of the temperature change times a number. And the number is just chosen so that the time paths all line up the way we want them to. In other words, if you have a warming in the tropical troposphere, the cap goes down. If it doesn't warm, caps will just naturally drift up over time by 1.3% per year. According to that rule, then, if we have the A1B scenario, then the cap drifts down by the line with the blue dots there. If you have a Stern-type warming, rapid warming taking place, the cap will strongly trend down out to 2030 by 95%. If you don't have any warming trend, the cap just drifts up over time so that the permit price stays at essentially zero, and then Points beyond that, wouldn't really matter. The cap would be slack and the market just wouldn't exist. So that little rule that I showed you would give everybody what they want, in the sense that no matter what your view of anthropogenic global warming, you expect to get your preferred outcome. So everybody should be happy. See, skeptics would expect the cap to remain slack, the permits market would collapse, and we wouldn't have to worry about the effects of it. There are some fence sitters that basically think, yeah, we're probably going to have a little warming, maybe we should do something, doesn't necessarily need to be too expensive, but just kind of to show that we're making an effort. So they would get a low price on carbon dioxide emissions that never really increases too quickly over time. The IPCCers would expect a steady reduction in emissions. The alarmists would expect deep emission reductions. In other words, if they all believe their own position, they would get the outcome that they want. Now, at this point, if you follow the financial markets at all, I guess everybody follows the financial markets these days, but there's an interesting contrast between scientists and traders in the market. So one of the complaints from scientists working in an area like global warming in academia is they feel like a voice in the wilderness, okay? They have important information, inconvenient truths, so to speak, that nobody is listening to, and they get frustrated, so they turn either to alarmism or lobbying or some way of being heard. They've got this important information that nobody's listening to. In the market, if you meet somebody who feels he has important key information that nobody else is listening to, he's the happiest guy on the street. Okay, they love to have information that nobody else has, because then you've got a trading advantage. So now suppose you do have a scientist who really believes, I have some key information about the future progress of climate and nobody else is listening to it. This kind of system would make that person especially happy, because if everyone expects, well, let's go the skeptic side. Everyone expects rising permit prices because they're all anticipating a strong warming trend, and the skeptics are sitting there saying, you know, I've looked over this stuff and it's just not happening, so I'm pretty sure they're all wrong. Fine, place your bets. You go short in the permits market, you go long in the emissions-intensive industry, sit back and collect your winnings. On the other hand, if everyone expects low permit prices because of the pernicious influence of skeptics in society, and alarmists looking at the data say, oh, they're wrong, these prices are going to have to go up because the supply is going to be shrinking. If you look at what's going to happen in the tropical troposphere, they don't need to get upset. They don't need to shout. They don't need to any of that. They just phone up their broker, go long on the permits market, go short emissions-intensive industry, and they not only get the pleasure of being proven right, but they get rich in the process. So, under this kind of scheme, there's no more need for acrimony, ad hominem, rigging reports, media hit stories, journal malfeasance, gatekeeping, blog wars, etc. Not to suggest that any of that ever happens, but just in case it were to arise in the future. If you really believe your science, put your money in the market and shut up. If you're not willing to invest your own money based on your science, then don't demand the government invest everyone else's. If you're right, you're going to cash in, and you'll get the policy path that you wanted. And if you're wrong, doesn't matter. Society will still get the right outcome. We might get a rapidly shrinking cap and rapidly rising permits prices. And if that happens, we'd have to say, yeah, I guess that was the right outcome. But we might not. We might get a cap that never really moves because the temperature just sort of ticks along, and against all the model expectations, nothing really happens. And if that's the outcome, again, we would say, yep, that was the right outcome. Now, there are some additional benefits which would sort of feed back into the science side, which is if you're in the position of, well, let's say there was mention made this morning of a large firm contracting for 50 years with a power plant for the electricity supply. The deal was apparently scuttled by the government, but that's what they were trying to do, make a 50-year contract for power prices. Now, if you're going to sign such a contract, you'd need accurate forecasts of the price of these permits, especially if you're going to buy them from a coal-fired power plant. You'd need the best forecast that you can get of the permit prices. To do that, you'd need accurate climate forecasts. This would create a market for accurate climate forecasts. It might surprise you that there's no such market today. There are a lot of forecasts being generated, but they're being generated under a very different set of incentives. They're being generated for publication in journals and for sort of what-if scenarios to look at different, trying to understand different processes in the climate system, but they're not being generated for the reason of generating the most accurate forecast possible. But this kind of scheme would create a market, and the forecasters that came to dominate it would dominate it because they make accurate forecasts, not because they have big fancy-looking models, or they can make scary-looking graphs, or they happen to get along well with the editors of some major journals, or whatever. They would dominate the market because they do a good job of predicting the future. And I have to point out that, let's see, up in Canada, up till March 5th, there had been about a week of cold, clear weather. And then on March 5th, it changed, it warmed up quite a bit, and then we had cloudy showers. Now, why is that significant? Because in the Farmer's Almanac, it says first week of March up to the 5th will be cold and clear, and then from the 6th to the 9th, it's going to be cloudy with showers. Okay, now Environment Canada didn't pick that up, but somehow back in the early fall, the Farmer's Almanac had already worked out that forecast. So maybe the Farmer's Almanac would emerge as the market winner in generating accurate climate forecasts. I don't know, but in a case like this, the market wouldn't really care how you do it. They wouldn't care if the model that you're using has a strong climate sensitivity or not. It would care about, do you get it right? And that would be a new set of incentives to come to play. Also, the market here presumably would be big enough that you wouldn't need to fund climate modeling anymore, because people would be willing to pay for these forecasts, so they pay for the good ones anyway. Now, having presented this kind of idea, one of the typical questions is, well, what do you do about the warnings of abrupt climate change? Well, in this case, actually a truth-based system, as I call it, would handle this very nicely. Because if you did have an abrupt change, that would mean that at some point in the future, let's say an increasing path in the market cap on permits would suddenly reverse, the cap would start to shrink, the prices would go up. If that kind of change can actually be forecast, people would build that into their decisions today. They wouldn't just pay attention to today's permit price, they'd be looking at the permit price 10 years from now, or the forecast of it, and if the good modelers were able to say, don't be fooled by these low prices now, because in about 8 years, everything's going to change, and troposphere is going to warm up, permit price is going to go up. Well, people would start taking that into account if it was a credible forecast. On the other hand, if it can't be forecast, if it's just pure guesswork, then the science isn't there, and we shouldn't be building it into decisions today if it's not a credible forecast or if the science simply isn't there. Now, I'm assuming that most people would actually like something like this, idealistic I suppose, but there is a constituency that would really hate it. And basically, the people who would hate it would be anyone who secretly thinks global warming is all likely a crock, but they want a cap-and-trade system anyway for any number of reasons, because they think they're going to cash in on it, they just happen to dislike Western industrialized civilization, or they fall into the mistaken belief that cap-and-trade creates wealth because they see the size of these rents that it creates and ignore the deadweight losses created alongside with it. On the other hand, there might be people who secretly believe global warming is a crisis, but they want to forestall emission reductions because they are invested in fossil energy, or they just have a pathological hatred of planet Earth, or something like that. And I suspect there are folks out there who think that this is actually a large constituency. I have yet to meet anyone who falls into this category, but they wouldn't like this either. Okay, so to conclude, do global warmers really believe their own forecasts? Then if they do, they should love a truth-based cap-and-trade system. They should like any kind of system that ties the path of global warming to the cap. That way, if their forecasts come true, they get the outcome they want. And there's no risk to everybody else in doing it that way. On the other hand, if you meet somebody who wants a system that forces down the cap every year, regardless of what temperatures do, then that, in effect, they are saying that they don't believe their own rhetoric. Thank you.